what you do every day at lunch.
Yeah, exactly. Po' boy. This is, thank you all for being here. Nice crowd. And seriously, you can sit in the steps or sit on the edge of the stage if you're students in particular.
Walter likes people to sit at his feet.
Yes, I love. We used to have a show called Romper Room, and when I was a young kid, my aunt was a host, and we all got to sit at her feet. So this is what we want for you, etc. I'm Walter Isaacson, and this is the first in our sort of American Values series. I want to thank Leonard Lauder, who helped to fund it. And our guest is, of course, Jon Meacham. Among other things, when he was 28 years old, and even earlier, he was a national editor of Newsweek when I was struggling to be a national and then editor of Time. They kept beating us on things like the Monica Lewinsky story.
You did just fine.
Yeah, I know. We survived.
Things have worked out for you.
Well, thank you. I ended up having to be in academia because it was hard to compete with Jon. But Jon also is a great American biographer, and we've sort of plowed the same row, which is in the academy, biographies weren't quite as popular when we were growing up. So people like yourself, Doris Kearns Goodwin, David McCullough, myself, Bob Caro, got that field of biography. His latest book, Destiny and Power, was George Herbert Walker book, and we're actually going to start there. He did American Lion, which was Andrew Jackson in the White House. He got the Pulitzer Prize. How do you win Pulitzer Prizes? I've never been able to figure that out.
I just, I think if you keep working at it.
Okay, I keep churning them out.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
Anyway.
I don't think your choices are diverse enough.
Okay.
I think that might be it.
Yeah, and people that they don't know, like Leonardo da Vinci. Yep.
Leonardo.
American Gospel, which is about God and the Founding Fathers. He's on Morning Joe all the time as a voice of history and reason. And Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, was another book. You also have a book coming out in about a month, which is a great graduation gift. His books are going to be there for people he'll sign, but the new one isn't out for a month, and it's called The Soul of America, which is how we've been in such divisive places before, whether it's the McCarthy era or the Reconstruction era, and somehow survived. And so it's sort of a hopeful book for the current divisive era we're in. But let me start with Barbara Bush, because I know you were very close to her, and your biography of her husband, one of the many gems in that book was her own diaries, which she gave you and allowed you to use, and her letters. And you're one of three people, if I can say this, right, speaking at the funeral on Saturday, the only sort of non-inner circle, meaning I think it's Susan Baker and Jeb Bush and Jon Meacham. Tell me what it was like working with her, why she was special, and what her sense of humor was like.
It was rough, and she loved it. No, I was very honored by her friendship, and I think I can say that. She was, what you saw was what you got, and I think that's why she was so popular in many ways. You could agree or disagree with her, but she wasn't putting on a show in any way. Mrs. Bush kept a diary from 1948 until very recently, every day. And so imagine putting a highly intelligent, great observer at the highest levels of American politics for 60 years, and you get this amazing document. And she was going to seal it for 50 years after her death. And when I heard that, after my cardiac episode, I went to her, and to use a very technical historical term, I begged her. I don't want to overwhelm you with this academic stuff, to let me read it. Because she is Abigail Adams, right? The only other woman in the history of the Republic to be both the wife and mother of a president. As she liked to point out, remember, Abigail Adams died before John Quincy won, and I'm not dying. So I asked her if I could do it, and she agreed. The only condition on the whole book, which I worked on off and on for 17 years, long time. It was supposed to be posthumous for the president, but as we can know, he'll never die. So he used to say, "Don't publish until I'm paws up." So the only condition was anything from the diary that I wanted to use, I had to just show her what she had said, not what I was going to do with it, but just so she could make sure she wasn't hurting a family member's feelings. I took her 80 pages of transcripts, and it was in Maine, and we sat there, and she read them. And it was one of them, it's one of those moments where you wish you had video of a moment in your life, because she would murmur to herself, she would nod, she would say, oh, did I really think that? And then at one point she looked up and said, I was an opinionated 33-year-old woman. It was like, yes, ma'am, and the apple didn't fall far from the tree. When George W. Bush found out that she'd given me access to them, he said, she gave you what? That is not good news for me.
Yeah.
The other thing, if you haven't seen it, in one of their last conversations in the hospital, President Bush, 43, came in, and the doctor came in, and Mrs. Bush said to the doctor, do you want to know why George W. is the way he is? The doctor said, sure, Mrs. Bush. She said, I smoked and drank when I was pregnant. So that's her sense of humor.
Yes, exactly. What were some of the nuggets, though, that became enlightening for your book?
Well, first of all, her family's impression of Poppy Bush, they met within 3 weeks of Pearl Harbor. You can't make this up. She was wearing a red and green holiday dress that caught his attention. He found somebody he knew from Rye. She was from Rye, he was from Greenwich. He said, I'd like to meet her. And he said, do you want me to introduce you? And he said, that's the general idea. Or however he would have sounded at 17, Holden Caulfield, that voice. Dana Carvey once said, the way to imitate George H.W. Bush is to be Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne.
Yeah, right. I get you. I get you.
Not going to do it.
Not going to do it.
And he actually started being more like Dana as the years went on. But her family, particularly her father, Marvin Pierce, who was a publishing executive in New York, were overwhelmed by this young man's charm and really charisma. And charisma is not a word. James Carville is here, and he was representing one of the most charismatic American politicians ever. And George Bush, particularly by 1992, did not seem like a charismatic figure. I would argue that his quiet, persistent charisma, which means gift of the gods, is actually the reason he was president. He had no natural political base. He never won a statewide race until he won some presidential primaries. He became president not least because of the charm he used to win Barbara Pierce in 1941, which was, as an old teacher of mine used to say, one understanding of charm is it's the capacity to make someone love you without their actually knowing quite why. And that's George Bush. And I defy anyone to have spent 10 minutes in his company in that long life and not say, you know what, I would trust him with ultimate authority. I mean, it's that striking. And her father, and it's very early in the diary, her father saw that and said, it wouldn't surprise me to see, it was in a letter to a friend, he said, I wouldn't surprise me to think Barbara has married this bright young lad from Greenwich, and I bet he'll be president one day. So that sort of jumps out in 1948.
Although his father was a senator, so it wasn't.
Later.
Yeah. Oh, Prescott had
Later,
not been a
Prescott.
senator.
He was still an investment banker at the time. But that's one of the reasons I called the book Destiny and Power, and because I don't know about Walter, but no one said that about me. And there are 3 or 4 examples, and Mrs. Bush was the first member of that campaign. I know that until Monday afternoon, when she died, she still thought that she was the luckiest woman in the world because Poppy Bush was in love with her. They were married for 73
years. Wow.
Longest marriage in presidential history. And I don't mean to be all sentimental, but if you're a biographer and you observe these families up close, and yes, they ask for power, and yes, they seek ultimate authority, but it's still hard. And to me, the second most interesting and the most interesting human account is the account of the diagnosis of their daughter Robin with leukemia in January of 1953. Imagine this for a second. So you're a debutante from Rye, New York. You fall in love at the age of 16 with this young guy who, when George Bush heard the news about Pearl Harbor, he was 17 at Andover, and he wanted to go to Canada because you could sign up for the Air Force earlier there. That's why he wanted to go to Canada. He's prevailed upon to wait until he's 18. They marry in 45. He's been shot down by then. So she sat, like so many hundreds of thousands of American family members, in the watches of the night, waiting to hear whether her husband was going to be dead or not. They moved to Odessa, Texas, staked by the family. It's not a, as Bush says, I wasn't exactly scratching in the ground. But still, it was y'all ever been to Odessa, Texas? Mrs. Bush's mother, Pauline Pierce, thought it was so remote that she literally sent boxes of soap and detergent to her daughter on the grounds that they didn't have those things in Texas. So you're in Odessa, Texas. Somehow or another, George Bush rents a duplex where they share it with a mother-daughter team of prostitutes. I still don't understand that. But as he liked to say, entrepreneurialism is important. And you have George W. Robin is born in 1949. At one point, he moves you from Odessa to Midland, but then he moves you to California to 4 different cities in a year because he's learning the business. She's got 2 toddlers. Jeb is born in January of 1953, and they come home, and this is all in the diary. They come home, and Robin is bruising easily. She's tiring. They take her to the Dr. Dorothy Wavell, who was the great pediatrician in Midland. They take her to the pediatrician's office, and the Bushes had never heard the word leukemia until they heard the diagnosis of their daughter. And so they go to New York, they go to Sloan Kettering for 6 months. At that point, Mrs. Bush is a rock. She's there for every treatment. George Bush sees a needle and his little girl, and he can't handle it, and he runs out. And she dies, Robin died in October of Columbus Day weekend of 53. And at that point, the dynamic in the marriage shifted. She had been strong, he had been emotional. It flips, and she becomes incredibly emotional, and he becomes her rock. And she talks about how George would stay up all night holding her in his arms as she sobbed through the night in Midland. And if you go to that house, you can see the hallway where Robin used to come across the hall to get in bed with them. And then suddenly there was no baby to do that. So this is a woman of parts. This is a woman who lived a very, a fascinating and real life. And I miss her already.
Mm-hmm. Wow, well, thanks. We were talking in the class. Jon came to the class I teach earlier today, and people were challenging you about some of your biography subjects, including about Andrew Jackson, who, as one student said, was involved in the 2 great sins of America, slavery and Indian removal. Why should we still have monuments to Jackson?
Well, if you have monuments, I wouldn't put up any new ones. We'll start there. Yeah. Wouldn't be prudent. Mixing the two quickly. I believe that if there are Jackson memorials, they should remain because Andrew Jackson, for all his manifold sins and wickednesses, as the Book of Common Prayer puts it, was devoted to the constitutional experiment in American liberty. He did not take up arms against the United States, unlike Confederate generals. He did not attempt to cut short what Gouverneur Morris called the search for a more perfect union in the preamble of the Constitution. And in 1832-33, Jackson stood in the breach against South Carolina, as ever, and said that the federal union must be preserved because in Jackson's view, we were one great family that could argue with one another, and should, but we had to do it under the same roof. He understood in a way, he wouldn't have called it this, but he understood manifest destiny in the sense that we now understand that this is a continental nation from an ocean to an ocean, and that we are one country. Nobody else understood that. As our friend David McCullough says, when people were walking around in the past, they weren't walking around saying, the past is very interesting.
Yeah.
You know, they were trying to work it out provisionally from day to day. And I think that without Jackson giving us that additional 30 years to form what Lincoln would call the mystic chords of memory, then we might look a lot more like South America, a lot more like Europe, with separate confederacies. Imagine if we had taken up arms against each other 30 years before the Great Cataclysm. It was hard enough with that additional 30 years. I think it would have been catastrophic.
It leads to a broader question, which is to what extent we should impose upon historical figures the morality of the day, which changes rather rapidly. I mean, as we were saying just 8 years ago, Jefferson-Jackson Day dinners were the norm. Likewise, maybe 30 years from now, people will be appalled on people who resisted gay marriage, and yet, you know, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton resisted marriage equality in their period. How do you sort out what type of morality you impose in retrospect?
Well, Arthur Schlesinger said that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap.
Yeah.
And so I think to some extent, one of the dangers about the past is it is ready-made for alleviating our own guilt, because we can think, well, we're not slave owners. We're not removing Native Americans, although I will point out I live in a state, Tennessee, that was entirely belonged to Native Americans. I think there's a danger in the flip side of the great man, great person, great woman theory of history is that, yes, individuals make history, but if we convince ourselves that taking down a statue or a painting or something of someone from the past therefore somehow absolves the country of the sin of which that person was representative.
Yeah, that's a Drew Faust argument. Like, this is easy. We get to absolve ourselves of our sins by wanting to take down a statue.
Yeah, so we take, you know, Walker Percy's point on this used to be, we know Lincoln was a segregationist.
Yeah.
You know, so one of the wonderful things about the country is that there is, uniquely among nations, this sense that we are, with the right disposition of heart and mind, we will make progress. We will have this is an unfolding drama. The world is not perfect, nor is it perfectible, but it's the French Enlightenment philosophers of progress were thrilled by the American Revolution because it was a political manifestation of the ideas they were debating at the Sorbonne and elsewhere. Of, you know, could the world always be a series of stages toward some better place? Mm-hmm. Say, in Augustinian terms, it was the idea that we were moving like pilgrims to a city of God through the city of man. In Aristotelian terms, it was would our sociability, would our capacity for empathy and sympathy for one another create more prosperity, more security. And by and large, the United States has managed from generation to generation to get this right. Now, it's also true that Winston Churchill was right, that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after we've exhausted every other possibility. Mm-hmm. And we are doing that at the moment. We are exhausting a lot of possibilities. Has he fired anybody since we sat down?
No.
That's to check, I find. I actually made that joke once, not too terribly long ago, and some guy in the middle of a speech said, he just fired Comey, and I thought he was kidding. You know. By the way, the best thing that ever happened to James Comey, he would not have been on Colbert as director of the FBI.
Exactly.
But anyway, it's like, imagine if Sir Thomas More had gone on a media tour.
Exactly. If there were book contracts and they had Twitter feeds.
Exactly. You know,
Yeah.
He got his head cut off,
Yeah.
Comey got on Colbert.
Yeah.
Maybe there's not progress. Anyway, my sense is that most politicians far more often are mirrors of their time rather than molders or makers of it. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to take Jackson off the 20, that's fine. I'm a white Southerner. I'm not getting in a fight with Harriet Tubman. Mm-hmm. Not going to do it.
Put her on, okay.
Fine. And yes, we should commemorate all sorts of folks. And it should be, and there's no reason not to have more currency and all of that. But what worries me about the whole debate, and if I'm worried about it, because I spend all my time thinking about dead people, I suspect there's some merit to it, is we're not looking forward or around us. We're looking back. And as long as the looking back and the amendment of that culture of commemoration leads us to do better now, that's great. But if you think your work is done on the unfinished business of the Civil War and the American experiment in liberty and slavery because you took down a statue, you're wrong.
In your new forthcoming book, you almost address this issue of, are we always going to progress?
Yeah.
Or is this time it's different? And you go through lots of examples from McCarthyism to the Jim Crow era and the Lost Cause narrative era, in which you say we've been through periods where we kind of got unhinged and got divisive and got hateful, but here's how we survived. Give me a couple examples and tell me whether you're optimistic that the pendulum always swings back and the pendulum, to mix the metaphor, keeps progress moving generally in the right direction.
Well, it may sound overly optimistic or Pollyannish, but as a matter of observable fact, what's our immigration issue right now? The immigration issue is that people want to come here. Mm-hmm. So, as a kind of a baseline question, we have our hearts and our minds tend to be in the right place. And when people say, oh my God, it's never been like this, okay, let's start with this. Andrew Johnson wrote in a state paper that people of color were genetically incapable of self-government. Okay, so that's not great. Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government, closed down 400 newspapers that disagreed with him on the First World War, and allowed the Attorney General of the United States to conduct armed raids of suspected dissidents without warrants. That's not fabulous, is it?
Even Franklin Roosevelt in World War II?
Franklin Roosevelt, who is a hero of mine because, imagine the human level here. It's like a little bit like the Bush story. Franklin Roosevelt's 39 years old. He's already been the vice presidential nominee of the Democratic Party. He's the brightest young politician in the Democratic Party. It's August 1921. He's gone to a Boy Scout camp to pay a visit on his way to Campobello. He wakes up and he can't walk. As Winston Churchill later said, not one man in 1,000, not one man in 100,000 would have ever left the house again, much less risen to the top of the great republic 4 times. He saves democratic capitalism from itself in many ways. On Inauguration Night, March 4th, 1933, and to remind you of how difficult that era was, the greatest public reaction to Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural was not the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, which he borrowed from Henry David Thoreau, but was the present crisis is such that it may require me to ask for wartime powers. And the crowd roared, and it chilled Eleanor Roosevelt.
Correct.
Who thought, oh my God, they want a dictator. They want a dictator.
And by the way, how did he decorate the White House for that inauguration?
Well, the 37 was Jackson.
The Hermitage, yeah.
And 4 years later, again, Andrew Jackson, the complexity of Jackson, because Roosevelt was taking on entrenched interest, he believed in the Depression, he had the facade of the Hermitage rebuilt for the Pennsylvania inaugural parade stand in March of 1937 in order to make it clear that he was a modern-day Andrew Jackson. When Arthur Schlesinger, just back to that for a second, when Arthur wrote The Age of Jackson, published in 1946, won the Pulitzer, he was like 12 years old. Really?
How old were you? You were 15 when you won the
Shut
Pulitzer,
up,
right?
Shut up. I love Walter. The Indian issue is mentioned twice. Go to the index, twice. And it was to, Arthur hated evangelicals' religious involvement in politics. He had this very New England aversion to it. And so he brought in the fact that the only people speaking out for the Native Americans in the 1830s were New England Quakers and evangelicals, and wasn't that terrible.
Yeah.
Arthur Schlesinger, as you all may know, is the poet laureate of American liberalism. And that was his view in the 1940s. So as Walter says, you wonder how quickly these things change. That's how fast they change. So, but on inauguration night, he's sitting there, the crowds want a dictator, and a friend comes in, Rex Tugwell, a brain truster, and says, very pretentiously actually, he says, well, Mr. President, if you succeed in this crisis, you will go down as the greatest president ever. If you fail, you will go down as the worst. And FDR said, if I fail, I'll be the last. Yeah. So it was an existential crisis about our way of life because there were two live options historically. There was Bolshevism, which was, remember, when McCarthy and the Red Hunters were going after folks in the late 40s and 50s, most of the people they were finding were people who in the early 1930s had joined the Socialist Club at Harvard or something, which is redundant, I guess. I came to New Orleans to deliver that line.
Thank you.
My work is done.
That's right.
I went to Sewanee, which, as you all may know, is a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance.
That's right.
Good. And European-style totalitarianism. Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's wife, wrote a huge bestseller called The Wave of the Future. And the wave of the future was does this sound familiar? The world was too complicated for a traditional politician. The Constitution was an antiquated document. We needed a strong man to upend the political system and lead us into a bold new future. That was 1935. So you ask, how do we get out of it? We got out of it because the better angels of our nature are, you know what, I'm not right all the time. The other guy probably has a point. And this system, as flawed as it is, has endured from generation to generation, and I owe it my loyalty. And that, to be fair, is the most disturbing part of the current moment, is I think there are live questions about to what extent the incumbent president is in fact devoted to that constitutional order. And that's a disturbing element.
Which is sort of a populist revolt against the establishments of, say, your Senator Bob Corker. Yep. I mean, it's not a Republican or Democratic thing. It's a populist revolt, which happens periodically in history, Andrew Jackson being a case in point, and others in the 30s and throughout our history. Do you think, though, that the populist revolt we're seeing now is partly due to the fact that, take your reverence for the Bush family, and some people for the Clinton, that 8 out of the 10 elections, during any student who's here, their lifetime, had either a Bush or a Clinton on the ticket?
Oh, I think a lot of people felt that. I remember asking Bob Gates that question, back when we thought it was going to be Hillary and Jeb, back in the prehistoric era when that was a possibility. The Peloponnesian War had just ended. And I asked Bob Gates, I said, so, Coke or Pepsi? And he said, can't I have a Sprite? Yeah. And if Bob Gates says that, that tells you something. I think two numbers explain this populism at the moment. One is 17%. That's the percentage of Americans who say they trust the federal government some or most of the time. That's down from 77% in 1965. So more than 3 out of 4 to fewer than 1 in 5. and the other is $130,000. And $130,000 is what economists believe a family of four needs to lead what we would think of as a classic post-World War II middle-class life. Household income is $57,500. So in that missing 70 grand, that missing 60 points of trust, you have a climate where something like Trump can happen. And there is a line, I don't want to be overly obsessed with 1992, but we had a billionaire with a funny voice who used new media to reshape a presidential campaign. Ross Perot is unimaginable without who? Larry King, right? That was sort of the Twitter of the time. He announced on Larry King, he would get out on Larry King, he'd get back in, he'd do everything. And he totally understood cable TV in the way Trump understands both social media and the vernacular of reality TV. And one of the reasons Bill Clinton was president is because he understood cable TV and the fusion of entertainment and politics in a way that, let me tell you, George H.W. Bush, remember Carville and everybody sent Bill Clinton out to Arsenio Hall to play the saxophone, remember? Let me tell you, George Bush thought Arsenio Hall was a building at Yale.
Yeah.
It was not a fair fight at that point. It was done, So I think everything has some analogy. I mean, we're living with, I think, a moment not unlike, what if Strom Thurmond or George Wallace had actually won?
Yeah.
That's
Well, we in Louisiana went through this period with Huey Long. It wasn't
Absolutely.
an ideological thing, but a populist revolt. In fact, James helped produce a movie, all the King's Men.
really good versions. Anthony Hopkins as Judge Irwin is one of the great insights.
And Jude Law. But anyway, James, let me, now that you've come up twice, grab a microphone, and earn your keep.
Well, welcome to New Orleans, and welcome to Tulane, which beat LSU last night in the baseball game. I want to ask you about the Battle of Araby. I mean, the Battle of New Orleans. Actually, should be the Battle of Araby, right, King or Chalmette? What would have been, and I think to a lot of people, it's a Jackson Square, and to people my generation, a Johnny Horton song. What would have been the consequences if Jackson would have lost that battle in American history?
It's a great question. If Andrew Jackson had lost the Battle of New Orleans. So, as we all know, the Treaty of Ghent was on its way back in a box to Madison, who'd been burned out of the White House and was presiding in the Octagon House about 2 blocks away. A couple of things could have happened. They could have decided to tear up the treaty if they had massacred the troops. There was also a lot of familial connection. Remember, Wellington's brother-in-law was there, and there was a lot of familial pride going on. It wasn't like Jared and Ivanka, but it was close. So that could have happened. If Jackson had lost, he would never have been president. If he had not been president, then it's hard to imagine the evolution of democratic lowercase d culture being the way it is. The other thing is Madison, the victory in the war solidified James Madison in a way that we don't think of him in political terms, but James Madison is the only American president to put the other party totally out of business. So the Federalists who had gathered in Hartford and basically debated, that was the first formal debate over secession in American history, happened in Hartford, Connecticut. They were thinking, you know what, why don't we go with Canada and Nova Scotia here? This goes back to my point about the map. It all looks like us now, but there was no reason it should have been, could have been. I mean, it could have been totally different. And by Madison, by putting them out of business, created a remarkable period of prosperity in the 1820s that I think really began to cement the Union. I argued in the Jefferson book that the period that basically the revolution was a 50-year war from the Stamp Act in 65 until the Battle of New Orleans. That if you read the letters of the founders from Yorktown forward, Treaty of Paris in 83, you realize they didn't think the war was over. They worried all the time about British agents, about British influence, and yes, maybe they were a little paranoid, but as Richard Nixon taught us, even paranoids have real enemies. So the ratification of the American experiment that culminated in the popular mind in New Orleans, without that, maybe there's a reopening of the question about, you know what, maybe Aaron Burr's onto something. Maybe we should have a Southwest Confederacy. Maybe we should let the Federalists go there. There was no reason for us to be this big and unified.
And be one strong nation,
Yeah.
which was not the case at the time. Let me, if I may, James, ask you, talking about the populism and Jackson and all and how that fit in. What is your view on Andrew Jackson as a populist and how that shaped Democratic Party and shaped America?
I'm going to defer to John, but I think there's a good argument the country needed a good shaking about that time.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty inevitable that something like this was going to.
In the 1820s, absolutely. But remember, he won the popular vote in 24. So, and there's something about my state that produces popular vote winners, and we can't quite close the deal. You know, the first 6 presidents were either Virginia planters or Adamses from Massachusetts. Andrew Jackson never knew his daddy. His father died before he was born. There's an interesting, I have a list of essays I will never write in my head. And one of them is, why is it exactly that American presidents tend to either have an incredibly strong father or no father at all? It's almost, if you're raising normal children, there's no hope. They will never. But we have an unusual percentage of recent presidents who didn't know him at all. 2 of them, their name isn't their name.
Clinton and Obama, or
Ford.
Ford?
Leslie Lynch King Jr. Was Gerald Ford's name. I do bar mitzvahs too, if you want me to come. I need to get out more. Bill Clinton was William Blythe. They didn't, Ford met his real father, I think, once. Bill Clinton, turns out, didn't, as it turned out. Obama, there's a picture we have of it, is standing, the one time he spent time with his father, one time, was Christmas when he was 11. It's a heartbreaking picture. He's slightly chubby. He's holding on to his father like this, in front of one of those old-fashioned Delta counters, airline counters, because he was on his way out. And President Obama once said, I talked to him about this once, and he said that he'd always thought men are always trying to either live up to their father's expectations or make up for their father's mistakes. And as he put it, he didn't have the expectations, so he wanted to make up for the mistakes.
Well, actually, that's the first sentence in Obama's memoir about his father, that men always.
My father? Oh.
Yeah. And his second sentence is, in my case, I think it may have been both.
No wonder that came off his tongue so quickly.
Yeah. He plagiarized himself. He recycled. But it's interesting.
He's very environmentally
Yeah, you know, that every
literary composting.
is trying to make up for the or live up to. Almost every presidential memoir like that. Even Richard Nixon, the first sentence. What's the first sentence of Nixon's?
I was born in a house my father built.
Which really, really resonates on many levels.
You want to take bets? You want to do it?
Yep.
That's it.
Even Ulysses S. Grant. But there is that, and Clinton is a very clogged first sentence, but goes on and on about his drunk father.
Well, and the great line from his acceptance speech. I was born on a summer storm to a single mother.
Yeah.
You know. on Jackson, so he loses his mother and his brothers during the Revolution. And so he becomes basically an orphan at age 14. And I think that the drama in his life was always to be a father because he didn't know one. And he spoke in paternal terms. When he issued his nullification proclamation on Monday, December 10th, 1832, I think the most important document of the early republic in terms of state papers, he says, I speak to you with the feelings of a father who would speak to his children who were running astray, that the union of these states must be preserved. So this is not a keen insight on my part. It's right there. You know, it's in the record. But James is right. We needed a shaking up.
Which may have been true after 8 out of 10 elections in an American establishment that left people behind.
Yeah.
That may be what
Does it
Trump
have to be
is
this?
about.
Does it have to be this shaky though?
You know what? There was somebody like, John Quincy Adams who said, does it
Totally.
have to be this shaky when Andrew Jackson came in?
Let me tell.
It
can I
does
tell-
have to be shaky.
Can I tell my hermitage story? No. Let me argue with you on that. Andrew Jackson, by the time he became president, had been a prosecutor, a judge, the first congressman from Tennessee, twice a senator, a general, had won the popular vote, accepted the result, and then the nominee a second time. He had a fundamental respect for the conventions of governance that I don't think we see at the moment. And so I resist the Jackson-Trump analogy, chiefly because Trump tries to make it. But let me tell my hermitage story.
Yes, please.
Okay, so in May of 16, for Walter's alma mater, for Time magazine, I went to interview the candidate Trump at Trump Tower. And it was about history, it was about how he was thinking about the office. It was brief. And low-hanging fruit, but fruit tastes good. So there we go. And Andrew Jackson never came up. And as Walter knows, because he's spent more time with her, I'm sure, than I have, what Secretary Clinton would have done in that setting is she would have read up on who was coming. And she would have said, oh, I read your book on X, and it changed my view on Y forever. And she would have been fibbing, and I would know she was fibbing, and we would participate in this kind of establishmentarian fiction, and we'd all feel good. He had no interest in that. He actually said, it's an honor to meet you. It's an honor. I've never read any of your books, but you're good on TV. So, but I actually kind of because he's not going to say that. I appreciated the candor. I mean, it was fine. So anyways, but Andrew Jackson never comes up, right? Never comes up. And it was difficult to get him to talk about it. I mean, because he wanted to talk about how he destroyed the 17 people, and it was almost everything you would hear anyway. I don't think there's a huge difference. I think what you see is kind of what you get from my experience. But anyway, so then the man I now refer to as the late Steve Bannon puts out after the election that Trump is a Jacksonian figure. And they put the Ralph Earl portrait in the Oval Office, and the rest is history. So, March 15th of last year is Jackson's 250th birthday, and I live in Nashville. And the president's going to come down and lay a wreath and embrace the Jackson mantle. And so I'm sitting at home, I'm thinking, I should do something, So I wrote an open letter to the president for the local newspaper, for the Tennessean. And I basically said, if you're going to embrace Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts. And Jackson had his moments. I mean, he once said that his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay and shot John C. Calhoun. Now, John C. Calhoun was his vice president.
Yes, right.
Now,
Trump has not said that about Pence yet.
well, no one said that about their running mate until John McCain. But anyway. Anyway. And wish him well, by the way. I know he's sick. Don't embrace the crazy. Jackson understood how to negotiate. He knew people thought he was unstable. He actually was able to leverage that. And he believed in the Union. He believed that we were, as I said, one great family. So anyway, I write this as a letter to Trump. And they run it on the front page of the paper, the whole front page of the Tennessean. Had no effect, of course. But this is a true story. I'm walking into lunch the next day, and my phone rings, and it's George H.W. Bush. And he's been in the hospital. He was in the hospital a lot last winter, and so his staff was trying to keep him entertained, so they showed him this thing I'd written. So I said, get Meacham on the phone. So I got it. He said, how you doing? I said, I'm fine, sir. He said, I read your letter to Jackson. I thought, the old boy's losing it, right? I mean, he's 93, he's in the hospital. I said, thank you, sir. It's good to hear from you. Mr. President, actually, it was a letter to Trump about Jackson. He said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention.
Raise your, okay, I see a hand there. Shout or wait for the microphone. Thank you, sir.
I have to tell you, this is probably one of the best ways to spend lunch. Man, when I see you next time on Morning Joe, I want to say, man, this guy is funny.
I'm very big in nursing homes.
Okay. I'm getting there soon. But anyway, but my question, and then I have a short little comment. The question is, since the teachers are waking up in Virginia and Arizona and Oklahoma, do you think that is a harbinger of some possible change coming in the country? And on the monuments, you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why. No, seriously. My next door neighbor's daughter just had a baby. The aunt, she says, Mr. Stanley, the monuments don't bother me. I say, of course it doesn't bother you because you've grown up with them. But for this newborn baby, he will never ever see that physical manifestation of those monuments.
Well, I think you were in favor of taking down Robert E. Lee and the Confederate generals.
I'm often wrong. I'm not wrong about this, though. About everything else. Let me be clear, and I've written about this. I think Lee should come down from public property because he took up arms against the Union. And my test is, but I would leave Jackson up, and Washington, and Madison, and Jefferson, who all owned slaves, and Monroe. And by the way, the Adamses were horribly racist by our standards, if you read their letters. I would leave them up because they were devoted to this idea that the journey went on with liberty under law. And we didn't have it all right then, but we were going to get it, we were going to get closer. If Lee had had his way, that experiment ends. And so there's no Brown versus Board, there's no March on Washington, there's no Voting Rights Act if the Confederacy had its way. So the point I made, obviously poorly, was to take down those monuments is the beginning of a story and to me, an obligation of activism, not the end of it. So that's all I'm saying.
And the other part of the question was, I think activism and walkouts by teachers in various places. Are we starting to see the pendulum swing now in a different way, or do you have any signs the pendulum is swinging?
In terms of guns, or?
Well, you talk about guns, or you?
No. The teachers walking out for increase in pay.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
The pay, that's what I thought about.
I have gone to a hermitage, and I got some mixed feelings on Andrew Jackson, but the enslaved guy is right next to him on the ground for the burial.
Alfred, yeah.
Alfred is.
Yeah. Yes.
Personal.
On the public education, that is such it's so complex, and it's beyond my ken. My wife works in this. I think we spend an immense amount of money, we don't get the results we want. I don't think there's a silver bullet solution. I think the conservative emphasis on charters and vouchers is an understandable but incomplete answer. And I think we also tend to put expectations that are too heavy on schools. That is, we tend to expect the school to solve an enormous number of broad problems. I think it's a fascinating moment, both in terms of that question, though, and in terms of the gun question right now.
Yeah, activism, sorry. Please, it's a little hard for me to see since there's lights in my eyes, but further
In the very back.
questions? Yeah. Shout, grab a microphone, do whatever you need to do.
I know you've talked a lot about Andrew Jackson, but I was just wondering, during the Battle of New Orleans, Jackson instituted martial law within the city of New Orleans and a large portion of Louisiana itself, and then imprisoned federal judge Dominic Augustine Hall. I just wanted your opinion on that issue.
Not a great moment for civil liberties. Look, Jackson, there was also a model that Lincoln drew on.
And by the way, that Franklin Roosevelt did far worse.
Oh.
With the internment.
Executive Order 9066, internment of Japanese Americans. Absolutely. Wilson and the Espionage Act. You know, I think obviously that it's a one of the many blemishes on Jackson's record, and I'm not offering Jackson as Hercules here. What I am saying, though, is that Andrew Jackson far more accurately represents the light and the dark and the kindness and the cruelty and the grace and the rage that all of us are part of.
Yes.
And he is a much more representative figure than George Washington, for instance. It's the reason I wrote the book about it, is because he was so complex, because he was capable of enormous democratic, progressive thinking for his time, and yet could be unspeakably and unimaginably wrong about everything else. And
But in that same executive order, he also says that he's going to allow blacks, freed blacks and enslaved blacks and whites and even people from Kentucky, believe it or not,
man.
all to fight together in units, that the pirates of John Lafitte, and he said we're all fighting for one nation and we should get to serve together. So it's part of the complexity,
Yeah.
that scene where he's doing that order. Yes, there, or John can call on him if you see people, but yeah.
So they say that behind every man is a strong woman. Just considering Barbara Bush and Hillary Clinton, how do you think representation, your women representative politics is changing how people live?
Well, it's changing fast. Did y'all see what Orrin Hatch said? Yeah. Did you see this? I think I have this right. Somebody fact check me. So they were passing an internal regulation to allow some of the female senators to bring their babies on the floor, right? And he said, what if we have 10 of them? And I was thinking, first of all, he is from Utah. Secondly, we have 100 of them. So anyway, no, I think it's a terrific moment. I've got one of the things that I'll find out in an hour is how my 7th grader just did in a student council race. So this is on my mind right now, my daughter. It's historically high. I was very struck, and I don't know if this was true here at Tulane, but at Vanderbilt and elsewhere, I was surprised by, among undergraduates, sort of that generational cohort, how little excitement there was about the prospect of a first female president as a first female president. That is, there was not, if I were Hillary Clinton, one of the things that would amuse me in a bitter and tragic way is how enthusiastic everyone now is for her candidacy. Right? I mean, I don't know if you all found that. Did you find that? Were you enthusiastic? May I put you on the spot?
Well, I'm from Texas, so I think I have a bit of a different perspective, but I think people were kind of disappointed that
It's a colossally, and this goes to the rapid change, the rapidity that things happen. The Me Too moment, the reaction to President Trump and his relationship to the right. Sorry?
Yeah, but what reaction?
The Women's March. So there's a lot going on, and it'll be fascinating to see who actually achieves that final electoral victory.
It's interesting that some social movements, just like some innovations in the digital world, catch on much faster than you think.
Yeah.
Like marriage equality, gay marriage, boom. I mean, if you had blinked, all of a sudden, Barack Obama and Bill Clinton had been on one side, or suddenly, and we look at it as, of course, we were going to do that. And yet other movements, I'll say guns, which this happens over and over again, but it doesn't ever catch on as a movement. And to some extent, the women's movement. I mean, I remember when we were young, it caught on, and yet, in some ways, we're still fighting the same battle. Why do some movements happen so fast, and some, like the gun movement, get stymied?
Because I think there's a mysterious moment where the habits and the dispositions of a leadership class intersect with all of us. And we spend a lot of time in this country talking about leadership. We don't talk about followership as much. But a republic, in classical terms, is only as good as the sum of its parts. So again, I think politicians tend to reflect more of the moment. The gun issue is an interesting one because the polling is so clear that the broad populace wants a certain set of common sense, what I would think of as common, and I'm a gun owner, I should say, but a certain number of measures, but the intensity of the lobby is so strong that it is a case where Madison in Federalist 10, who always wanted to check rapid progress, was too clever for his own good. So I think that's the hardest one to shift. I think they are particularly difficult when an issue is at once political and cultural.
That's interesting, except for guns are obviously cultural, but so too was traditional view of marriage, right, or not?
It was, I think, yes. But I think that was one where there was not a bit, I mean, maybe Will and Grace had a moment or something, some pop culture effect on it. But it was, I mean, Obama, as you mentioned, Obama was against it in 2008, chided Joe Biden, remember, for saying, he got out over his skis, And then if you read President Obama's speech, here's a day in the life of the presidency. The same day the Supreme Court decision came down on marriage equality was the day President Obama went to Emmanuel AME Church in South Carolina to speak to that service, where he sang Amazing Grace. That was the same day. So it matters who we send to do this job.
Yeah, I'm sorry, did you have somebody you were about to pick out?
There was a gentleman over here.
Okay.
Oh, that was
Yes,
Bill, is that you? William? No.
Mr. Meacham. Walter quotes Alex Haley, who said, "The most powerful phrase in the English language is, 'Let me tell you a story.'" I agree. We need to know each other's stories if we're going to come together in our polarized nation. Would you comment?
I agree. The only thing I would add is an old LSU faculty member, Robert Penn Warren, who wrote a poem. I have it roughly right. Tell me a story. Tell me a story. In this century and moment of madness, tell me a story. Make it a story of great distances and starlight. Make it a story of deep delight.
Bravo. Very good. We'll have James
This gentleman,
do the
I'm sorry,
stench of the Dido and the smell of the grave quote later.
The Jackson issue is real big for New Orleans, I think, in the coming years, so I want to go back to that for a minute. Andy Young recently, in an interview, pointed out that his father was named Andrew Jackson Young, and he spoke out in defense of Jackson, and he said, to follow on what Walter said, Jackson not only asked for African Americans to fight, but he promised them their freedom afterwards and delivered on it. And Young doesn't have all the genealogy, but he's pretty sure that's why he can't identify slaves in his background. So I'm wondering if that's true, could he be seen as someone who actually on that issue, compared to some other issues, have been seen as maybe ahead of his time?
History is complex.
Yeah, I mean, I want you to write that. Absolutely, sure. I think that Harry Truman used to say, the only thing new in the world is the history we don't know. And that's why this is so fascinating. I loved being in Walter's class. They were terrific students. And they were asking really good questions about wrestling with just these questions. You know, how do you feel about a country that from 1877 until 1965, functionally, this was a region with my home region anyway. Y'all sometimes count yourselves, sometimes you don't.
As Southerners?
I think the Republic of Louisiana should just stay right there. I like to visit. I married a Mississippian, so the only sense in which she married up was marrying a Tennessean. But we have hardback books, stuff like that. But you can tell she's not here. But it was functionally apartheid. You know, if you look at this in global historical terms, you know, if you sort of take off your patriotic, you know, if you really want to look at it clinically, we have a very difficult and complex and not entirely happy history. And the remarkable thing is that we've done as well as we have. This is still the most durable and successful experiment in pluralistic republicanism in the history of the world. And I think that's why people are so passionate at the sense of any kind of threat to it. Is the threat exaggerated? Maybe. Do I think fascism is coming to America? No. Do I think it's always a danger? Yes. Why? Because it comes to other places, and they didn't see it coming either. So vigilance, eternal vigilance, is the price of liberty.
And it's also the cause of history,
Yep.
which is what we're here for. I want to thank you because one of the things we try to instill here in the history department at Tulane is that it's not just one damn fact after another. It's why change happens and who resists it and who causes it. And to understand that is so important if we're going to keep on that progress you've talked about. We have a pen, two pens actually, a pen and a pen for you, both with Tulane's logo.
Thank you.
You'll be signing books and answering more questions outside.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, my friend.
Dr. Meacham, standing.
There we go.
overflow crown.
Thank you all. Thank you.